Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology. And with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. One of my favorite TV shows is how it's made. However, one of the most frustrating aspects of the show is my own curiosity, because often they will start with something that is already made. For instance, they'll say, the engine block arrives at the factory and is put on the assembly line to receive pistons. And all I can think is, but how is the engine block made? Traveling down this reductive road, we ultimately end up finding all of our materials coming from exploded stars, which in turn forged those materials in layered fusion furnaces turned on after the gravitational collapse of matter from the Big Bang. But how is the Big Bang made? Today, we're talking about causation.
That's just delightful, my friend. That's a lovely way to begin.
I was feeling, I was in a little bit of a lighter mood this week, so rather than getting too heavy with the monologue, I thought, I'll use a personal example, but that really is the struggle, right? When we start thinking about causation, we end up on this reductive road from nowhere to nothing.
No, there we are. It is reductive, and yet it gives the answers right from the start. But it's not quite the answers we were seeking. But it gets us to, we're back to star stuff. We're all made of stars. We're made of the same stuff as stars. There are atoms that aren't going to ever go away.
Yeah.
There's an immortality in that. If the whole universe goes away, do those atoms hang around, or do they just get pushed into the next universe? I don't know. It's fascinating. But that still doesn't answer about the engine block, right? And I feel the same way about looking at projects on Instagram, these little reels, and I follow some sites that show you quick things that you can do as crafts and so on from working with my granddaughter, and I save those and I watch them, but they go fast. They have them on super fast speed. I'm sure there's a way of slowing it down. I'll figure it out. I'll watch a YouTube video and figure it out, but I'll ask somebody. But I watch and I watch again and watch again and say, but wait a minute. You point to these sticks and then they're on the paper. Did you use a glue stick? What did you use? Because that matters.
Right.
There are steps in the process. Cause and effect, cause and effect. But of course, not everything discernibly has one cause.
Yeah.
And so on and so on.
Yeah, so that's a really good down-to-earth example of the whole issue of causality.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, how'd you get from here to here, right? Mm-hmm. And there's different types of causality that we can look at different ways.
And it's been talked about across the entire span of philosophy.
So what is a cause?
A process or an event, or choose your verb. It's both it can be a noun, but it also can be a verb, because it is something that makes something else happen. And the simplicity of that, or the vagueness of that, is what allows for all kinds of argument across time about this. That many philosophers who we've named over and over have, for instance, debated furiously across centuries, but with each other in that way. Can a thought actually be a cause? And how does a thought actually lead to physical activity?
Yeah. It's monism versus dualism again,
it is.
Right? Like how can mental stuff cause physical stuff? How can there be an interaction between these two things that cannot have an interactive component?
Exactly. So we're laying out, we're sort of opening the pathway here. We were talking pre-show about you and your brother taking a walk and a woodlot, and you're following a path, or you're making your own path. So there's that dualism versus monism. There are different varieties of causes, because of course we categorize everything, and the legal idea of of causality is very different in many ways than the physics idea of causality. So we can't go anywhere wrong.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we could talk about philosophical thought chronologically, but like when you think about Aristotelian causality, some of it, I don't know if it's going to be as relevant to our conversation as
I don't think
the thoughts of Hume maybe. But do you want to outline the basics of sort of logic and process philosophy?
Yeah, so you mentioned Aristotle, who said a beginning is that which does not itself follow anything. By causal necessity, it just comes to be. Well, we know where those stories are.
That's going to be problematic.
That's problematic. All right. And then there's the material cause, that out of which something is made. Now that sounds like that out of which. So that, in your shop, in your factory, the material out of which something is made. Okay.
If you're an empirical reductionist, is that the only kind of causality you believe in, do you think?
Reductively and at base, probably yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was just kind of curious.
Yeah. Because the efficient cause, the source of the object's principle of change or stability. So what makes that object what it is and what makes it change? Now we're going to Heraclitus. Is it a river?
Yeah.
Is it right? Okay. Can you step in the same river twice? Can you pick up the same piece of rubber twice? Can that be recycled? You were talking about scraps. We're pretty sure we're talking about lots of things, but so can those scraps be put back in and then come back to be made something else again? That would be the efficient cause. The formal cause, the essence of the object. What is it that you can't get beyond that makes that object that object? And then the final cause, the goal or the end of the object. What's the object good for, or what's it made for? And that kind of stuff slews out into conversations that can be maddening, such as somebody said, well, what's art good for? We've talked about art before. It's good in itself, yes, but does it have a use? Yes, but not the kind of use you necessarily mean. And so, but we're talking about causality in that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the ugly side of Aristotle's teacher, right? It's sort of Platonic in nature to be. What is the
blame
final,
Plato for a lot?
Yeah, what is the final cause of? What's the purpose of this thing? But yeah, so that's good. So that's Aristotle's sort of viewpoint. The different types of causes, which I think a lot of lay people don't really think about that when they think about causes, right? You think of a cause and it just seems like one thing, but really there's a lot of different ways you can think about something being a cause.
Yeah.
Do they all have a temporal component? Is time an important part of causality?
I think so, but time in vastly different ways. Because you can talk about a specific type, so that my car broke down yesterday because fill in the blank. Now, you might be right, you might be wrong. You might already know, you might not. You might be conjecturing, but it's still my car yesterday. And that's different than overgeneralizing or generalizing with a use, but saying that frequently a person who has this position will make this kind of decision. So suggesting that the nature of the position will lead to decisions. That's vaguer, it's bigger. It's not the same thing as talking about your car yesterday. So there's a temporal nature because it's still within lived lifetimes, but it's not as focused.
Yeah, I guess when we're thinking about, was the efficient cause Heraclitus in the river?
Yeah.
If you remove temporality from that scenario, then really there's no question of efficient cause, right? Because then the molecules that make up the river are static, and then there really is no question about whether you can step in the same river twice because it is the same. The water is not moving.
Yeah.
So
there's no question that we're all made of, I mean, we could just stop the conversation now. We're all made of the same stuff. Therefore, we're all alike throughout the universe. The end.
Yeah.
You won't get a good grade for your book report, but
right. Yeah, I mean, I didn't say spoiler alert in the intro when I mentioned that, all material stuff comes from stars in the Big Bang. And the reason for that is because all it takes is a couple of variables for that picture to get really muddy. So what are some of the prominent views philosophers have had on causation throughout history?
Well, we're going to jump. I want to jump us into the 18th century because that was a hopping place and time. And that's where you have Kant and Hume going at it. And where we start to get this idea that correlation doesn't imply causality, but we'll get back to that. But the idea of Hume, one of his says causation is a relationship between two impressions or ideas of the mind. So it's all going on in here, between the temples, right? That's because you have this idea, then you have this idea. Essentially, what you're doing is moving from one idea to the other. That requires experience. You're creating an experience or setting yourself up to do this. Oh, I think I need to trim that shrub. Well, if that's a cause, that means it leads you, it motivates you, it impels you to do something. Go grab a tool and then go to the shrub. Examine the shrub, decide where it needs to be trimmed. Trim the shrub. Put the tool away. There's a whole string, because when you trim the shrub, that's a cause for then being done and then putting the tool away. So we mustn't oversimplify and think, oh, there's just one cause and effect.
Yeah, and there's an interesting kind of corollary to Hume's thought, right? Which is that we can't directly experience causes.
Right.
And there's some interesting scientific evidence to support this today, where they've done a lot of studies monitoring brain activity and questioning people about, hey, we're going to ask you to raise your right hand. And basically, we want to tell you when you report that you've made the decision to do so, and we'll just monitor that. And so they test, okay, when did the electrical activity start in the brain? When did the person report making the decision to move the hand? And when did the hand start to move? And what they find is that the electrical activity that's starting the movement of the hand begins about a second before the person consciously makes the decision to move the hand. That raises issues of causality, right? And it specifically goes back to Hume talking about, can we have any direct experience with causes, or can we only indirectly sort of experience them? And this takes me back to our conversations a few months ago when we got real abstract and we were talking about white holes with Carlo Rovelli.
Okay, yeah.
And specifically, how basically the way everything exists is as this wave of potentiality, right? And so there was a cause, something caused this wave, and this wave is moving, and this wave is responsible for all of reality. But do we have any direct experience with it, right? Or are we, as Hume said, just sort of in the chain, in the link, and we have some glimpse into it, but no direct experience?
Well, and right, which takes us into many things, or potentially can. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle, the idea of subjectivity. I mean, that's what Hume, among many other things, was talking about, is that subjectively, cause and effects relationships are not going to be precise because it's all going on in one's mind, that one's determining these things. And even though in that time there wasn't the equipment to measure, as you were just describing, it's not it's not inconsistent with our own time, because it's essentially saying you can't really see this going on, even if you light up monitors with it. We don't know quite why that's happening. That I think of where we try to find the seat of consciousness again, which we were talking about. No, it's not on the map.
Yeah.
But he says, because it's all going on in here, and because we are subjective, causality cannot be proven. And if we get to talking about on the surface of legal things, that's really what goes into part of law. The harder part is to prove that somebody had an intent.
Yeah.
How do you prove an intent? That's really difficult. And so that goes back to Hume.
Yeah. All right. Hume is definitely the big one. Is any other philosophers you'd want to cover who have sort of talked about causality?
Well, Kant was arguing with Hume, so we'll talk about Kant. He says we derive a causal connection from any repetition of similar events because we already have the universal causal principle. It's built into nature. So we see an event repeated, and then we decide that we think we know the answer. So he's not arguing with him exactly, he's developing it more. We can't say that instead of the laws of nature, laws of freedom may enter into the causality of the course of the world, because if determined by laws, it would not be freedom, nothing else but nature. So Kant was taking us into that determinism versus individual choice. Pure causality would be there's no freedom.
Right.
And the people who argue the mechanistics of the brain, the totally mechanical model, would say, well, it's all built in there. Genetically, chemically, mechanically, it's there. But even most people who just go by that model wouldn't say that there's absolutely no freedom, because somehow we act or don't act. We control our impulse or we don't. We're able to control our impulse or we can't. But they were at that time using the word nature, meaning unrestrained, whereas law meant that you're being restrained. So this hops us into all kinds of political potentiality. If you just listen to rhetoric and you say, well, this song just it niggles at me so much. I'm proud to be an American where at least I know I'm free. Oh. First, that implies there's no other freedom anywhere on the planet, which is just ridiculous. Second, oh, really? How do you define freedom? Because essentially, law and order becomes part of freedom. Oh, all right, so we invent laws. We make laws. Set them down. You have the freedom to do everything but this. Oh, but now you don't have freedom to do this either. But you did have the freedom to do it, but now you don't. So it's not really freedom. Other people are determining what you're free, so you are not free. And so that, just a simple song can take you back into deep thought about what the word freedom means and what the word determinism means, or consequentialism, which is this opposite. So anyway, I'm rambling on, but that's...
No, I think that it's really important. And like you were mentioning, it has deep consequences for how we view things. I know, anecdotally, I won't mention any names or relationships or contextual elements to protect the identity of those involved. But I know somebody who this week was compared to an Auschwitz guard, right? Because an individual who did not follow through on what they needed to do in order to obtain a document or form, and came in with a half-finished thing, could not secure a service that they had intended to secure, right? And so they viewed the attendant person's rejection of their incomplete form as a type of restriction and sort of mono, just this overbearing structure, right? Whereas obviously the person who's on the other end did not see it that way.
And obviously the first person has no idea what Auschwitz is about.
Right.
The person is not applicable.
Yeah. So yeah, how these things meet out, it's important to make decisions based off of what our views are on freedom and what our views are on law and order and what our views are on and it is a murky place, right? Because I remember when I was in the Army, there was a kid, we were both pursuing PhDs in psychology, and he asked me, he's like, do you believe in free will? And I go, yes, in a qualified way. And he goes, I don't know. He's like, I just don't know anymore, because if you look at the criminal justice system, right, you find based off of a person's, if you take these genetic factors into account and these maturational factors and these environmental factors and all of these different things, like you can predict pretty well if a person's going to be a criminal or not, And you and I were talking before the show, about how me and my brother walking through the woods and how different types of trees grow depending on what their environment is and all this different other types of stuff. But, the main takeaway was, I said, there's a key thing you said there, and that said, you can predict with pretty good accuracy. You cannot predict 100%, Right. There is no minority report, right? Where we know ahead of time, you're committing a thought crime, and there's 100% chance you're going to do this thing, right? And so that's where this idea, and that is the struggle that we talk about on the show quite a bit between the scientific paradigm, right? The material reductionist thing that says if we had initial states, we could predict the future and everything's just applied physics. Mm-hmm. And the other end where you go, oh, well, no, there's complete freedom and nobody's constrained by anything, and you should just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and all this other stuff, right?
Which leads to sloppy, messy, and more inaccurate than it has to be kinds of thinking. Samuel Johnson, a literary figure in the same time period we talk about, said the core of philosophy's hardest problem is essentially this: all theory is against the freedom of the will, and all experience is for it.
Yeah,
and it really comes down to that. But that I'm thinking of something because we just think of things as we go, right? Think about where people mistake cause and effect. So all of us manage to do this in one way or another. For instance, if a police officer arrests you, then you are guilty of whatever you were arrested for. Way too many people think this. And I would assert that way too many police officers probably think that's the case too. That's not their job. Their job is not judge and jury. We know that because there have been TV shows about it. Law and order, right? The law picks you up, the order takes care of things. But just because you are brought in as a suspect, just because you are arrested for something, does not mean that you are guilty. On the other hand, just because you say you're not guilty doesn't mean you are not guilty. So the cause and effect, that has to be all followed through with process. We call it due process. But there are an awful lot of people who don't believe in due process because they betray that notion when they say, well, please pick them up. They're wrong. Because that's so much easier.
Yeah.
It's so much less messy. It's so much more theory.
Right. And it gives us an unearned trust in our own subjective experience.
Yep.
Which is what you were just saying, right? An experience always wants to be for freedom, right? We always want to believe that our perceptions aren't leading us astray, that our thoughts aren't leading us astray, right? And so if we have a trained professional police officer and he arrested somebody, he made the right choice. But we know from a psychological viewpoint that that's not always true, right? And there's been plenty of cases where, it's much harder after the fact. We're not going to pretend that it's not. Months later, when a judge and a jury and prosecutors and defense attorneys are presenting evidence and trying to reconstruct what happened months earlier, it's a lot more difficult to do than if everybody had been there in the moment. But not everybody was there in the moment. There was two people who each remember it completely differently.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the concept of causality, right, is we think that there is a necessary connection between events. Where we fall short is we think that, we can pin exactly always the connection between events.
Yeah, that it's just that simple.
Yep.
And it's not. So causation is inextricably linked with metaphysical questions.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to review some of them?
I do. I'm just trying to think of where to start. Well, let's start with the more organized metaphysical and work outward. Let's posit a religious system, for instance, that says you are born sinful. You are guilty from the moment you begin to breathe. And the only way to be less sinful, or the only way to be sinful less enough to be taken to heaven or some paradise, is by accepting the grace of a miracle. Metaphysically, there's all kinds of stuff in there, which suggests that there's a pre-made structure. You're done before you even start. And in medieval times, there was even I don't know. There was a lack of there was a restriction on how many numbers were actually going to be able to be saved.
I think that even happens today. There's some language referencing
an economy of scarcity
being chosen,
basically.
right?
Yeah.
And so in that case, if somebody else is choosing your place, then by definition, you are not choosing your place, right?
Right. But we'll move away from that. Metaphysically, we've talked about the block universe before. Well, if everything is already in a stack, so to speak, a great big book, however we like to picture this, and just we're limited in our own temporal mortality, that we can't see all of that, but pull back far enough and everything is able to be seen. We've talked about what you can see from a distant star if you had the telescope right now. You're seeing back in time. All right, so metaphysically, it could be possible to say that all causality is irrelevant because it's all there from the beginning. So that would be deterministic.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to what we were saying with Heraclitus and efficient causality, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the water in the river is not moving, then there's no question whether you can step in the same river twice, because you are both in the river and the same molecules are there. So the river is just one thing.
Yep.
It's not a continuous motion. And so that's where the temporal nature of causation becomes necessary, like we established early on. Without any temporal perspective in which to couch causality, causality sort of loses any kind of meaning in a way.
And this is where we get into, and I'm not trying to tramp too far deeply into the academic, but this is where we get into the 20th century, late 19th, 20th century, with people like Alfred North Whitehead, and then Russell working with him, being a student of his, where he's talking about the philosophy of organism, and we're back to the dualism again, and saying that essentially it's already built in. It's not built in as in you have no choice, but the idea is organic. So that having freedom of making choices, one cause leading to another thing, is the only way that we can be, because it's one at the same time free will and deterministic.
Right. We're freely choosing a path that could not be any other way.
Yeah. And because he was back to how mind can affect stuff. And we don't know exactly how it does it. Why should consciousness, one of the things he's talking about is if all material is mechanical, the problem of causality lies in itself. Why should consciousness exist at all if it has no power?
Yeah.
Because we got the brain making us work. We could be automata more walking along. Our brains would make our bodies do things, would make our pick up food and that. But if consciousness is more than that, and now we're finding out, as we've said before, the beauty of these conversations, the fun, the joy in it is just to keep saying, okay, well, we've been this ripple, this circle, and now let's dive back into these other things we're talking about. If we find that animals are finding that animals have consciousness, or even finding that some plants seem to have consciousness, if there's consciousness in everything, then no matter what we do, we are hurting something, destroying something, and there's an ethical dilemma in that, an overwhelming problem in it. But and then he went into a thing called anti-realism. The perception is only the representation of an object, or in general terms of the external world. Whitehead was saying that get rid of that. You can't, the perception that you have is part of the notion of the object or of the world. He calls it prehension. We shape it in here. That's not necessarily the way it was. And you were just saying two different people, two different viewpoints. Thus our political situation again, right?
Yeah, and this is kind of what we were covering with postmodernism last week, and
it is.
In various ways throughout our conversations over the past few weeks. Is again, where do we draw the line between saying there is an objective reality out there, and therefore there is a truth which applies to everybody, but also saying that everybody kind of constructs reality in their brain and it's different for everybody, so there is no objective reality. How do you mesh these two things? And it's very similar to the question of consciousness, right? Where you go, well, is the physical machinery of the brain and all of the initial states of the universe causing me to go down this path, and therefore consciousness and free will is just sort of an emergent property of that provides some sort of qualia, some sort of feeling that in actuality has no purpose? Or is that thing that is inconsequential from one paradigm the very thing that drives all of it in the other?
That's it. Well, okay. So I've just scrolled through all my postmodern notes because you've just covered. But it does take us. I guess what I'm trying to say is, even when you get into currently, Judith Butler and Martha Nussbaum and some of our current philosophers, there's a touch base back to Whitehead, or in some ways there's a touch base back toward Aristotle, but primarily toward Hume, of this realization that we are subjective creatures, no matter how we try not to be. And that can take us into even artificial intelligence, where we think, oh, well, we're creating this thing that can be objective. No, we're not. People are objecting vociferously to all of the biases that are being built into the increasingly cognizant artificial intelligence. Well, if biases are built in, that's a subjectivity. That's a human subjectivity. So whatever we create is not going to be past our own subjectivity. It may do different things with it. It may be a subjectivity that is a group, a collective consciousness, not a collective unconscious, that will not act the way we would want it to act because it'll have its own biases.
Yeah, I think a good sort of thought experiment, right? I always like taking things to the extreme because it adds some amount of clarity, right?
Yeah,
A good
fun.
thought experiment, right, is thinking about Platonic ideals, right? What is a chair? What is the perfect chair, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we envision that, what we envision is something uniquely suited to human beings, right? The ideal chair, it is not going to look the same for a human as for an elephant or for some alien species that we have yet to discover. Or to discover us.
Elephants don't sit in chairs, and we don't even know that they're aliens. So what difference does that make? I say, going wink, wink, and nod, nod.
Right. So, but what it highlights, right, is that all of our conceptions about what is ideal and what is good and what is perfect, right, stems from a human-centric viewpoint.
Yep.
And human-centric is the most general and objective that we can get. But within the human experience, on top of that, I have a uniquely white, male, 35-year-old Western New York bias that's also built on top of that causes that to narrow even further, how my view of the world and increase my biases and my blind spots and everything else. So that, okay, well, the unique chair the Platonic ideal of a chair to me would have some people's legs swinging. They couldn't touch the ground. Others' heads would be between their knees because it's too short.
Yep. You see, this is exactly for me the beauty of a conversation about causality, because it reveals so much across time. And I'm saying this because I'm going to visit very, very, very briefly some of the other people we have talked about in past episodes and where they were with causality. All right. We talked about Ralph Waldo Emerson. We talked about transcendentalism. But the sureness, listen to the sureness of the male white voice, right? Cause and effect, means and ends, seed and fruit cannot be severed. For the effect already blooms in the cause, the end preexists in the means, the fruit in the seed. It's all there. Well, we were saying that earlier, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And then there's Blaise Pascal, who we visited a while back. God instituted prayer to communicate to creatures the dignity of causality. Oh, if you just pray, that's a cause, it will have an effect. Wow, there's certainty, isn't it? I chuckle at that and not in an injurious way, but just to say, look.
I mean, if you think about it, it's sort of analogous to a modern hippie girl saying that like good vibes are going to manifest in the universe in a certain way.
And one hopes. I would love good vibes to manifest. Where are they?
Right. We have no way of saying they don't, but logically and rationally, we don't have any reason to think that they do.
Judith Butler says, if performance requires a power to affect or enact what one names, then who will be the one with such a power, the naming power? And how will such a power be thought? How might we account for the injurious word within such a framework? The word not only names a social subject, but constructs the subject in the naming and constructs, therefore, potential violence. The cause of naming leads to an effect.
And that's more postmodernism.
Yes.
Both the good and the bad.
Yes.
It's all encapsulated there. But yeah, it provides a completely different perspective from Pascal and Emerson.
Yes.
Did you have other ones, or was that?
I do, but I don't want to overrun us. So.
I didn't want to interrupt you because I think that it's a very cool illustration. So you got some other ones. Go ahead.
Well, Martha Nussbaum, she talks about the idea of disgust among many other things, and how disgust has been used as a cause to then enact law and order as an effect. And while seemingly on the surface, that would be fine, except when you say, yeah, but not everybody's disgusted by the same thing. And disgust She says it's an inevitable part of human life, and no doubt it often serves a useful role, sometimes steering us away from types of danger. If we understand its connections to thoughts, though, thoughts about contamination and purity that are ubiquitously mixed up with prejudice and stigmatization, we will not agree with some who say that disgust is a sufficient reason to make a practice illegal. We'll confine legal regulation to cases of genuine harm, and we will not honor the claim that simply thinking about what people do in their private space or in their lived life is a harm worthy of legal regulation. I'm disgusted. We all can be disgusted. Therefore, let's make a law and stop this thing. No.
And that's entered into the realm of science now. Within the past couple months, they ran a study looking at political affiliations, and they accounted for a number of different factors in order to try to come to some conclusion about what correlates most closely with different political ideologies. And what they found was people with conservative political ideologies, their political ideologies were best predicted by their disgust response. Best predicted over any other factors. So yeah, it's such a strong emotional response. And we know this also from brain imaging. When you see the disgust response light up in the brain, it's a very powerful section, almost overriding any other aspect.
But if we agree that human beings are subjective creatures and we don't have the same perceptions, then to enact things based solely on that.
Yeah, it's inherently irrational, right? The rational parts of your brain shut down in response to the disgust mechanism. And so you can say objectively that you do not make rational decisions when your impetus is disgust, right? So that's an interesting cause and effect relationship, right?
I'm done.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. It was a great illustration of how human bias and specifically our specific contextual factors contribute to how we view the world as being organized, right?
Yes.
So, do necessary causes exist or only sufficient and contributory causes, do you think? This is kind of what Hume was thinking about, right?
I think that both can exist, but I don't think they exist in equal measure. I think the contingency of overdetermination, or in other words, that's a term referring to the many causes for one effect. Or indeed, the reverse it and say there can be many effects for one cause. I don't think that but clearly there are, well, I shouldn't even say clearly. There are seemingly, one could think of, so let's try, something that has a single cause and one effect. Can you think of one?
And well, that's what I was struggling with when I was writing this question, right? Is looking at the different theories of causality.
Yeah.
When I was looking over these definitions of necessary causes, sufficient causes, contributory causes, I thought a necessary cause seems to me to be almost outside of the realm of explanatory power. In order, to say that something can only occur if something else causes it. I think that when you look at like probabilistic causality, right, which says that, okay, well, if you have a thing, then it's likely this thing came before it.
Yes.
To me, that seems to be about as close as you can get. It seems very hard to say that if we have this thing, then this other thing must have occurred.
Yeah, we have to understand something so completely that, and I think that we do have understanding enough. I think it's just the almost omniscience kind of thing that bothers me about it. So a necessary cause, the things that have to exist in order for a phenomenon, a result, a thing to take place. You mentioned something, again, when we were talking before the show, about something that you have accrued through knowledge in the workplace that not necessarily anybody else or few would have, about having to do with rubber and water and metal. And that if you used a coating of water or wash something.
Yeah, water-based release.
Right. But that you wouldn't get, there could be problems.
Right.
Right. So the necessary cause, you could say, a necessary cause is to not have wet rubber for that particular device. Is that right?
Yeah, not to use that release.
Okay. But it's something that has to exist in order for something to take place. All right. You have to have life to have consciousness. Okay, but what do we mean by life? Because now we know the conscious. You must have you must have a heart beating in order to have consciousness. We're finding out that
that's not true.
That's not true. So for me, I'm sure there are, and plenty of scientific people could sit right here and say this, or medical people would certainly. So I'm not going to sit and say there's no such thing, but I don't think that it's as all inclusive.
Yeah, I think probably the power with necessary causes, or the problem with necessary causes, right, is our lack of knowledge rather than the lack of their existence, right? Because we talked about in the past how the human body is sort of like alien technology that we stumbled upon, right? When we look at a car, humans built cars. So whatever breaks down, you'll be able to find somebody that knows what went wrong and knows how to fix it and can understand it, right? Mm-hmm. So there's sort of a necessary cause there in a way, right? Okay, this thing does not work. We have this problem because of this cause.
This problem wouldn't have happened without the necessary conditions leading to the problem.
And so I think that the view of the scientific paradigm is that the human body shouldn't be any different, right? We should be able to say this mental disorder is caused by this deficiency in physical matter. But the problem is we didn't build the human body, and so we don't have insight into how the parts work or the functions they serve or the complex relationships between the matter.
And because not everything is attributable to the physical, measurable
right. And so
machine.
I think the nature of the mystery plays a big part in the ideation of necessary causes, right? Because if you look at the mystery as saying there's no way of knowing, leads to different views about causes than saying that the mystery is due to just the lack of our ability to identify, Mm-hmm. So
and it can be misused. I mean, the other part of this is the absence of any deterring factor can be considered a necessary cause. And people will use this in rhetorically or argumentatively fallacious ways. If we remove all blockades to X, then these terrible things, Y, are going to happen. So you got to have the deterrent. Otherwise, you'll have sheer chaos. Well, you don't know that. You're just saying that because it's how you view the universe. And so it can be used. It's not a clean, pristine, scientific only application.
Yeah, that's kind of like counterfactual theory proposed by David Lewis, right? I'm kind of with you with that. Like this does not bode well, in my opinion, right? Because you're taking what we've examined so far in the course of this episode is the complexity of the cause and effect relationship, yes. Right? And so when we talk about necessary causes, that's necessarily simplifying the cause and effect relationship to sort of a one-on-one A causes B relationship. And we have problems with that because the world is so complex, right? When we talk about something like, like the winds, right? You can't predict the wind because there's so many factors that go into changing it moment to moment that, weather models can't really grasp it. So in a counterfactual theory, basically what you're saying is you're simplifying it even further, saying, okay, well, the whole chain, right? We kind of have an idea of how the cause and effect thing goes. And so if we remove any link in it, then it doesn't.
If this hadn't occurred, then this wouldn't have occurred.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think that one, I really don't think that we could ever have the knowledge to back up in any significant way, because just because something didn't occur doesn't mean that some other force or combination of forces couldn't have led to the sort of triggering the next chain.
Yeah, I think if we engage in this psychologically, I think people do. I think many of us do frequently. If only I had, but because I didn't do this, then that happened. Well, okay, maybe even probabilistically, but not for absolute assured, guaranteed. No, very few things I think would be that way. There was just some obvious survival things, but even those are not necessarily, if I hadn't crossed the road when the light was the wrong color, then I would have gotten bumped by a car. Okay, yes. But if you had crossed the road against the light and there didn't happen to be a car there, then you wouldn't have gotten bumped too. So,
right. Or maybe you didn't take into effect that at that exact time you had received a text message. And so actually, if you had gone, the text message would have caused you to stop and you would have checked it and you still wouldn't have been hit, or any sort of combination of factors like that. Or there was some distracting bird call that would have stopped you. There's other things that you didn't notice at the time because your attention was taken up with this other thing. But if you removed one causal chain, that opens up the cognitive capacity for other stimuli to come in and affect your decision-making and the route that you would have taken. Yeah. And so, it's sort of presenting causality as this simplified chain in which any removal of the chain sort of breaks the effect. It doesn't really...
Which is not to say that we're trying to reduce all of this to relativistic mush. It's not. If then works.
Yeah.
In as a tool.
But I think that's why I'm saying, to me, I think it's all probabilistic causality, right? It's all saying, yes, usually if you have B, it's because of A. I think that's the best we can do. Right? Maybe even in 99.999% of times, if you have B, you have A. But you can never say, I have a hard time thinking that you can say, because A, then B. Probably the closest you could get, right, is when we were talking about metaphysical problems with causality. It would have to be the origin of the universe, right? Because even with the block universe, even if everything is static, unmoving, the same, time is removed as a variable, there's still stuff that exists. And so that stuff is an effect in itself because of its mere existence, right? So there has to be a cause to that effect. Yeah. I think that might be the closest there comes to a necessary cause. And again, that statement in and of itself is rife with religious, theological, teleological sort of
implications.
Yeah.
Or context.
So is the notion of causality then necessarily reductive, right? We mentioned that at the beginning of the show.
Yeah, yes, causality can be, it is, the process is reductive. Something happened. I mean, I love detective shows, right? Oh, this happened. And we're trying to, did it happen because of this? No, how could this have happened? No, this person must have done it. Nope. And, and so it becomes a process. And I enjoy watching the process because it doesn't grow old to me because there are so many different ways that something might have been done. watch the episode of the week. How did this person get killed? In England, it's often with a hard, blunt object. That just tends to be culturally that way. But so it's necessarily reductive. It doesn't have to be ridiculously reductive or reductive to the point of uselessness. It can be reductive as a tool to narrow. And I think that's what happens in counseling, for instance, and probably many other things too. Even my dad and all his mechanic work. How many times did I hear stories about somebody coming in thinking a problem was this, and then he thought this was the problem, and sometimes it was, but sometimes nope, it was something else entirely.
Yeah.
Something got into the system and you didn't find out till you dismantled everything, and then you found the bolt inside the carburetor.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of, it's the ultimate question, especially when it comes to dualism versus monism, right? But I think ultimately, just scientifically, it's the ultimate question. And I think that, yes, causality, even as a notion, it's certainly reductive. You can't have cause and effect without a reductive chain of events. I think what trips people up is that most of the metaphysical things we've talked about, the origins of the universe, the origins of consciousness, free will and determinism, justice, right? And volition, they're cold cases. That's the problem. That's what causes people to have such issue with them, is that if it's a detective show, you can follow all the leads, you can interrogate all the suspects, you can find all the clues, but you still just can't get back to who the suspect was, right? And I think that's where then people want to invoke, causes that are non-reductive, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that it actually exists.
We have often bounced back to the tree in the forest.
Yeah.
If a tree falls in a forest and no one's there, is there a sound? And we've approached this for a variety of ways, but going back to necessary conditions, to determine if there was a sound or not, you need some kind of measuring device, some kind of data gatherer, whether it's an ear or it's a machine at a distance, a sensor of some kind. So the necessary condition is a receptor.
And that's an interesting observation in light of past episodes that we've done talking about consciousness, right? In the different ways of it. So yeah, this is a fun episode. A lot of connecting back to things that we've talked about in the past. A lot of opportunities to talk about other things in the future. But until next time, keep pondering.